So we're going to get started on our presentation. So as we've talked about for a long time, managing floodplain development and approximate A zones tends to be tricky for floodplain administrators trying to understand what to do. So what we really wanted to do for this presentation was kind of look at the FEMA Guidance 265 that talks about how to deal with development in the floodplain in the Zone A, what requirements each local floodplain administrator should be implementing. And we're going to kind of go through those today to make sure that you have a good understanding. So when you look at floodplain, and this is Zone A, we have a little map here at the bottom of the slide. It kind of shows an area where it shows the 1% annual chance of floodplain. The boundaries have been determined using approximate methodologies. So we know that there's a stream in an area. We know that there's a low-lying area that has the propensity to flood. And so you just kind of have that information on your map. There's no published base flood elevations on the flood insurance rate map or in the flood insurance study report. So it does make it difficult when you're trying to implement floodplain management to tell someone exactly what to do. Or if I'm a citizen coming in and needing a permit, it can make it tricky what to do. So we have this old schematic where you just have the vector-based maps, and then we went in to more detailed ortho imagery on a floodplain map. This is from the National Flood Hazard Layer. So if you're looking something up in Tennessee, this is what you would see. You can see the imagery, and then you can see in kind of the upper right-hand corner, you can see Zone A. So it does present a lot of problems because if you don't have a base flood elevation, it makes it hard trying to go out there and enforce local floodplain regulations. And the lowest floor elevations must be determined for permitting. So if someone comes into a local floodplain administrator's office, let's say I'm Leslie and I'm coming in to see you, what am I supposed to do, right? So if I come to Covington and I'm going to move there and Skip is going to be super happy, what would I do if I was developing in a Zone A? So a lot of times when people come in, they have questions as far as what they're supposed to do. A lot of times floodplain administrators or folks that are developing a piece of property have to obtain flood insurance. And sometimes a lender and sometimes a flood insurance agent will say, hey, it's going to be harder to try to rate your policy because we don't know your level of flood risk. And then another issue is with the recent flooding that we've had across Tennessee. We had the recent disaster declaration. Sometimes people want to do benefit cost ratios for mitigation projects. And that can be more difficult to calculate if you don't have the base flood elevation versus the lowest floor elevation. And then some water surface elevations need to be estimated. And there's a whole process that we will get into for that with this. The intent of floodplain regulations is really trying to minimize the potential for flood damage to new construction, and then also trying to avoid aggravating existing flood hazard conditions that could increase potential flood damage to existing structures. So really, when you think about flooding in a community, as a floodplain administrator, you should be concerned with existing development that's in your community, what the level of risk is for those structures, as well as making sure that you're trying to minimize flood damage to new construction. And then when you think about in Tennessee, we have riverine floodplain areas. They require that the lowest floor, including the basement, but again, if you're going to be building a house, you really don't want to recommend having a basement because for flood insurance purposes, it's going to make insurance rates through the roof. But you want to make sure that all new construction, substantial improvements of residential structures be elevated to or above the BFE if you have that known by talking to a state or federal source or having it 3 feet above the highest adjacent grade. So when you're looking at it and when you're working with folks, based upon whether or not they can get a base flood depth from the Corps, or if they can find a flood study from TVA to determine the base flood elevation, or if you work with TDOT to see if there's a bridge nearby, if they have a base flood elevation established, or if you're really savvy, you can look on the FEMA Map Service Center website to see if there's been a letter of map change nearby the parcel where you're working at to see if you can get a base flood elevation that way. So when we think about delineating zone A's and looking at maps, there's really two ways to be able to check that out in Tennessee that most people use. The first one is a Tennessee property viewer. On the left, you can see where you select the county, select the type of search you want to do, enter that information, and then you can click on the Show FEMA DFIRM layer, and they'll show whether or not there's floodplain on the property. And another service that people use is the FEMA Map Service Center website. So those are two really quick ways to look to see if there's floodplain on the site. If it's an unmapped stream, or if you do have a Zone A property and someone's giving you a site plan and they're putting in a culvert, you want to make sure if there's any kind of engineering analysis that needs to be done. But these are pretty much the two ways to kind of look something up pretty quickly to know if a property has floodplain on there and what the level of flood risk is going to be. When we think about working with residential or non-residential structures, the regulations, the statewide flood damage prevention regulations, has a standard in proximate A zones to have the lowest floor of the building to be elevated to a level that's at least 3 feet above the highest adjacent grade. And again, should a solid foundation perimeter walls be used to elevate a structure, having flood openings, foundation openings to facilitate the equalization of hydrostatic and hydrodynamic forces. So I think about having a permitting process. One of the things that we're trying to do with these webinars is to try to get folks to be more comfortable and have more capability when they're doing over-the-counter consultation. So when we think about doing the permitting process, we want to make sure that we complete a floodplain development permit that require a site plan. And the plan should be drawn to scale, showing the nature, location, dimensions of existing and proposed development, if there's earth and fill placement, storage of machinery equipment, and drainage facilities on the site plans. And then you also want to require a finished construction elevation certificate. So there are requirements for obtaining BFE data, and the Code of Federal Regulations in 6.3 B4 requires that communities obtain, review, and reasonably utilize any base flood elevation and floodway data available from a federal, state, or other source. So there is a requirement that if there's data available, that the surveyor work with other state and federal agencies to try to obtain that information. Sometimes it is not available, but if it is, it's always good to try to check that out. And when we're talking about obtaining and utilizing flood elevation data when you're issuing permits, and then there can be an automated hydraulic and hydrologic analysis. It's model-based for Zone A. So if you have a development that we'll talk about later, if it's 50 lots or 5 acres, whichever it is, there is requirement to have a study done, and then you can use studies that are conducted by other federal or state agencies. And then you're also going to check to see if the elevations have been determined for nearby development. We talked about earlier letters of map change, and then for subdivision requirements, just making sure that there's a detailed study to post development. Now, if there's going to be a large subdivision that's going to be occurring in an area that's Zone A, you want to make sure that you review that data before you start issuing permits for development to make sure that that engineering analysis is Zone A and they're going to be doing a detailed engineering study. You want to make sure that they're using the same sort of model that FEMA uses to develop flood studies. So, you know, if you do have questions with that, you want to make sure that my office can review that picture free, make sure that it's compliant before the development that occurs. So when we're obtaining estimated elements, again, you can use H&H analysis if it's done correctly, and then other sources of data. We're going to talk about in a little while simplified methodologies. You can look at to see at least if someone is proposing development, does it make sense? There's contour interpolation where you do point on boundary, and there's also data extrapolation where you can use a insurance study profile and extend that up to 500 feet as long as the topography is the same in the area. And then if none of these are necessarily available, you can always require a detailed study to establish a true base flood elevation. So when we're thinking about H&H studies, we continue to be bombarded with these for different floodway developments around the state. And then when someone is running those analyses, typically FEMA does not necessarily have any kind of HEC2 or HEC-RAS data. So an engineer will have to hire a surveyor to go out and compute elevations and delineate where the stream and floodway would be to be able to estimate a 1% chance flood elevation. And there are some communities that do have base level engineering studies. So Giles County just got it recently. Sullivan County just got it recently. And then there is some communities that have non-regulatory flood insurance study profiles for Rutherford County and Wilson County. So there are a few counties that have additional information. You just have to ask the floodplain administrator for that. So when we think about checking for other sources of elevation data, one thing that we can't stress enough is to make sure that you have development permits when structures were built they're in the floodplain. We recently had a community that's applying for a hazard mitigation grant, and they cannot confirm that this zone can't be elevated. Can you guys please mute your phones? Please mute yourself. And then for state agencies, you can go to the Tennessee Department of Transportation if there's plans for nearby bridges. And then we're going to go over Army Corps of Engineers, TVA, and then with some of the preliminary watershed studies that we're having throughout the state, what to do when you have preliminary data versus your effective data. We'll be talking about that for FEMA document 1-98. Carrie, do you want to go ahead and talk?
Hi, Amy. Oh, wow. Yeah, there's all kind of feedback. Sure. I'll be glad to talk. I'll bring up my presentation here.
I've got it already up if you just want to go ahead.
Okay. Did you get the slides I sent last night too?
I went ahead and incorporated them.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Here we go.
Yeah. So TBAs, we can't really help with unnumbered A-zone data that nobody has computed. We can help with things that we have done that just haven't made it into the flood insurance study, but most of it has. So we'll go on to the next slide. So what I wanted to do was to show you where the Tennessee River watershed is as regards to the state of Tennessee. The FEMA flood studies that TVA did from the 70s through the 80s, when TVA did a lot of these studies under contract to FEMA, and the vast majority of that data did get incorporated into the various flood insurance studies. So the bottom line really is, if TVA did a detailed study, then it's in a flood insurance study and it's on the flood insurance rate maps. And if you are in the Tennessee Valley and you see a numbered A zone, you're welcome to contact me, but I'm probably not going to find anything. And speak a little bit about best available data and then our reservoir data, and then mention to you all that we have flood reports that went back in, kind of did a historical survey through newspapers and personal recollections and observed events. Those reports were compiled from the 50s through the 70s, and then also in some of those situations, TVA entered into agreements with different communities to do flood risk reduction projects pretty much in that same time period. And these flood reports and those flood risk reduction projects are mainly of interest to engineering firms that are trying to do a flood study now, or an ORISE, or just figure out what happens so that they can move forward with whatever they are working on for their clients. So we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so I also, here is a little map I worked up. The blue is the Tennessee River watershed boundary, and then also the state of Tennessee boundary where applicable. So, you know, bounded in the northeast by Virginia and bounded to the south by Alabama and a little bit of Mississippi and a little bit of Georgia. So if you are within that boundary, then TVA may have done a study. If you're outside that boundary, TVA is probably not going to have anything. And so if you're looking at HUC codes, the Tennessee Valley is in 06, either 01, 02, 03, 04, and then whatever the sub, the more detailed HUC codes. But that's going to be Tennessee Valley. In the state of Tennessee is 06. And then the other HUC codes, 08, 01, and 0513, are going to be Memphis or Nashville, and 0511 is going to be the Louisville district of the Corps of Engineers. I think 513 is the Cumberland Basin, and then 511 goes into the Green River. And so anyway, if you're looking at HUC codes to help you figure out what major river basin you're in, 06 is going to be the Tennessee River and us at TVA. And like I said, I sent a PDF of this little map to Amy, and so it's an 11 by 17 PDF, so that can be distributed to everybody. It might be a handy thing to have in a notebook or something as a easy, quick reference. So next slide. So like I was saying a minute ago, we studied a whole lot of streams in the Tennessee Valley and very few streams outside the Tennessee River watershed. But like I said, I'm happy to look. It's pretty quick for me to look, and you know, we might hit pay dirt. And then if not, you can reach out to my federal friends at the Corps of Engineers in Nashville who might be able to help you with what they do, which they'll be talking about later on. So next slide. Kind of repeating myself here. Like I said, TVA entered contracts with Fema in the 1970s and 80s and kind of ended in the mid-1990s to do studies for them, to not only the modeling, but also the mapping and the whole compilation of the flood insurance study itself, the document as well. We don't do that anymore. Back in the mid-1990s, it was a management decision at TVA to get out of the floodplain management business for external stakeholders, and now in the last 10 years, we don't have the resources, we don't have the people, we don't have the money to help shoulder the burden on a model ourselves. Even within TVA, we can provide some assistance, but our H&H folks are doing a whole lot of dam safety work. And so anyway, if a stream in the valley has a floodway, TVA probably modeled it, and they probably modeled it a long, long time ago. And so that will go to the next slide. The kind of models that we have in the early 1970s, they were, we call them HP 360s. It was a model run on an old Hewlett-Packard system, and these old ones were done using the punch cards. And so those 360 programs, we have a microfiche copy of a paper printout, and that's what a FEMA has a lot of times. So that's about all we could provide if we can find those. And then after that was HEC 2, from the latter part of the 70s to the early 90s. A lot of those we have input files in text format, and so those are easily importable into RAS. And I guess if you have the old HEC 2 program on a really old Windows machine, you can just run it directly. But what I have done is bring those HEC 2 files in and chosen the option in RAS to run the model HEC 2 style, and approach it that way. So we have those input files. We have a lot of those. And then not so many HEC RAS models, because that kind of came along at the end of TVA's run as a contractor for FEMA, but we have a few of those models, and that's mainly from the mid to late 90s, maybe the early 2000s, but that's really not many RAS models. And so we have those models, the native files, the HEC RAS model files themselves. So next slide. Best available data. This is more, and you can go to the next slide there too. This is more a commentary than anything. We may have, especially one of these early HEC 2s or one of those 360 models. It may be the current effective model, but it's 45 years old, and there may have been development in the area that's not accounted for in whatever that model has. Shouldn't be, but it could be, especially if there's a floodway. But with the way that computation, H&H computation has changed since the 70s, it may be time to do a new flood study. I'm obviously not a FEMA person, and I don't know. I feel a little squeamish, as did my predecessor, in providing data that was that old. And there may not be any way around it, but it's so old that you might want to put some thought into maybe doing an updated study. So that's just a comment more than anything, just personal opinion. And so next slide.
I have one thing to say, amen.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm glad you feel that way, Amy. Reservoir data. we'll go to the next slide there too. We've got unpublished reservoir profiles. There was a push in the late 2000s to do HEC-RAS models of our reservoirs because we did a good job modeling the main river reservoirs, and we've got those, I know, in HEC2 and maybe some RAS models of those as well. And then in the late 2000s started doing the tributary reservoirs. So we have a lot of tributary reservoir models, Douglas, Norris, Cherokee. Some of them have been incorporated in flood insurance studies, some of them have not. And maybe Amy and I can get together offline to talk about incorporating what we have. But I have a lot of people call me for elevations on the reservoirs, and I've been doing this for 8 years, and in that time I've only had 2 recipients of those letters push back on the information provided. And since that time I started putting in that TVA computed these using whichever version of HEC2 or RAS, whatever, and then when we computed it, and they were accepted, and life went on. So we do have those reservoir elevations for a fair number of reservoirs. And I guess next slide, please, ma'am. So the flood reports. Fortunately, TVA's river management library space has dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. But one thing that through the years TVA has acted as important was keeping those physical reports, the paper reports, in our library. So we have a lot of these flood reports, and they were done anywhere from the 50s to the 70s, and engineers and others went and talked to people in the community. They went to museums, they went to the local newspapers and dug back through articles to find news reports on different floods, firsthand account of floods, high water marks, and observed floods, all kinds of things to get as good a picture as they could of the flood history of different streams. So we have a lot of those. We can provide that information. A lot of times I'll just make a PDF copy of the report and send it, or portions of the report. A lot of times people know exactly what they need, and instead of a 40-page report, I'll just copy off 6 or 7 pages of it and send it to them. But we have that information. Again, that's more for people like the engineering firms, and they also provide context for recent flooding. So we have that information. And then the next slide will show these flood risk reduction projects. Again, that was through the 50s through the 70s, where, let's say, TVA compiled a flood report, and then 3 or 4 years later, the community experienced a flood. The community reached out to TVA, help us do something to minimize this flooding going forward, which resulted in a lot of these flood risk reduction projects, which were stream, I say channelization, but TVA would go in and reshape the stream bank to kind of give it a floodplain. Sevierville, the Little Pigeon River in Sevierville, is a community. It was done in either 60 or the early 60s. There through town, St. Paul, Virginia, Oliver Springs, Tennessee, Crab Orchard, Tennessee, the Brainerd Levee in Chattanooga. These were all projects that TVA collaborated or cooperated with the local community to construct these projects. So there's a lot of data in those reports also, but those were for specific places at specific times, but there's information in those reports too. And we'll go to the next slide. I think we're getting pretty close to the end. Yep. Yes, we are. So feel free to reach out to me. I'll see what I can find and provide it to you. And thank you for including me, Amy. This is great information. And otherwise, just kind of going back, I would send everybody back to FEMA 265 if we don't have anything, and the Corps of Engineers in Nashville. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, so now we're going to have the Corps. Mark, do you want to go ahead and start?
Hey, Amy. Yeah, I can start.
All right.
So I'll explain Aras. If you go back to the previous slide, Amy.
Sure, sorry. So,
you're good. Aras, he is the head of our FPMS Floodplain Management Services. Him and Ashley Fuentes, they are both the heads. She's the planner and he's more the engineer who kind of coordinates with us, who assists with the projects. But my name is Mark BZ. You can go to the next slide, Amy. You said it right at the beginning.
Okay, yeah.
Good. So my name is Mark BZ. I'm a hydraulic engineer at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the Nashville district. I work in the hydrology and hydraulics branch. I have assisted with some of these finding. So what the Corps does is we can find an approximate base flood depth for these zone A's that you can use to find an approximate base flood elevations. So a depth is different than the elevation. A depth is just the depth of the water, but you need a base to add that to. We can provide that. But I've assisted with some of these studies and projects and that we received from property owners and surveyors. So the slides this morning, my slides will just be a brief summary of our process for finding these base flood depths and how you can get into contact with us and get this process started. And these two figures on this slide on the right, we have the top right, that's a zone A, which doesn't provide you any like your base flood elevation, which you need. So this is a firm. So if you have that situation, you could contact us or contact TVA, as Carrie said, to get an approximate base flood depth for that. And then the bottom right is zone AE, which does provide you the BFE, which you could use as a proof for future. So you can go to the next slide, Amy. So what we do at the Corps is we get an approximate 100-year floodplain depth or base flood depth. We determined this through USGS regression equations. We use Excel. We find the hydrologic zone and the drainage area of the stream on the property to calculate and a base flood depth. This depth you can then be added to a surveyed normal water elevation, which can determine an approximate base flood elevation. So this picture to the right shows like our final report that we would send to you guys once we completed the analysis. It provides like the information that you provided us, where it is, and you can barely see it. I think it's 14.2 feet. That's the base flood depth that we provide that you can add to a surveyed normal water elevation. And a normal water elevation, that just means what water elevation it is for most of the year. Just like a normal, not during a flood, just a normal water elevation. Amy, you can go to the next one. So the information needed, what we need from you guys. We need information on the location of the property, which could be an address, GPS coordinates, parcel map, or a county parcel number. It's preferred to have all this information when y'all send it to us, but what is required is an address for the most part. So once we have that information, and a payment is received, we are usually able to get the final product to you within 2 to 3 days. If you haven't received word from us after like 3 days, please contact us at the contact information given in these slides and coming up. Next slide, Amy. So I think Amy showed this. This is FEMA. This is a way to get an easy, quick check of what zone you're in. This web service gets flood insurance rate maps at the link above, the link above on the slide. It's called Fermets. You just input your address or coordinates and it'll output a firm that lets you know if the property is in the floodplain and what zone that property is. Next slide. So once you got everything together and you got all your information ready, the next step would be to contact us. I would recommend contacting Ross, since he's the head of our floodplain management services. He coordinates this effort. So either email the floodplain email there, or I'd also probably recommend emailing Ross at that email provided. Next slide. So the cost of the service is based on the level of effort it takes to acquire the information. Most requests will cost around $180. Some special cases could cost $210. For example, like if a property has 2 streams that we'd have to analyze separately and get 2 different base flood depths and compare those 2. That would be a situation where it might cost $210. But I spoke with Ross yesterday, and he said that he's only ran into one project that's had the $210. So most likely it'll be $180 cost. And once you have that, you can make the check out to the address below provided, Army Corps of Engineers, and the address below that. Next slide, Amy. And that's all I have today, guys. So in conclusion, so the Corps of Engineers will provide the approximate base flood depth that can then be added to a surveyed normal water elevation that can give you an approximate base flood elevation. We will need specifics of the locations of the projects to aid in our work, and the results will be provided usually 2 to 3 days after information and payment is received. That's all I have, Amy. Thanks. If you do have questions, I don't know if we're going to do questions now or at the end, but up to you, Amy, but that's all I have.
Does anyone have any questions? Let me stop sharing my screen so that we can see in the chat feature.
Yeah, this is Carrie Williamson. I will say that the Corps, I'm pretty sure that they can only do those little studies for unregulated streams. That is, streams that don't have a dam sitting upstream of them. So if you're looking at a place, say on the Duck River downstream of Normandy, or the Elk downstream of Thames Ford, or other reservoirs, then if there's a dam sitting upstream, they're not likely going to be able to do one of those little studies for you. Just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Yeah, that's right. If there's a regulated dam or something just upstream of that, then our analysis wouldn't be very accurate. And also, there's certain ranges of drainage areas. If it's drainage areas below 7, I think, square miles, or above 700 square miles, then our analysis, the regression equations, do not provide an accurate result. But we'll look into that when we have your information and get back with you if we can't do the analysis.
Does anybody else have any questions for Mark or Carrie? You do type them in the chat. Okay. Well, thank you both appreciate your time and technical expertise to helping us with this presentation. So we're going to continue on. So let me start my screen again. All right, so we have an actual example. We have Malcolm and Linda Crawford. They had a Zone A property. So can you guys please mute yourselves, just so that everyone can hear well? I appreciate it. So as you can see here on the elevation certificate, they have a piece of property that was in the city of Portland. As you can see here on B8, the flood zone was A, the base flood elevation was NA. You can see some other errors that was done as far as the map panel, the firm index state, so on and so forth. So Malcolm and Linda were pretty frustrated because unfortunately their surveyor had the wrong building diagram number and had the highest adjacent grade and lowest adjacent grade backwards. It flipped them on their form, so they were paying $9,000 for flood insurance. So we sent their elevation certificate to Flood Smart. They have an elevation certificate review process where they'll look at it to see if it was done correctly. And they recommended, based upon the building diagram and how some of the information on the elevation certificate was not correct, to have a new one done. So as part of that, with them being in the Zone A, they contacted the Army Corps of Engineers, and they were able to get a base flood depth. So I reached out to Phyllis Cole. I paid $180. We met at 10 Cup. I got her coffee. We had coffee. She went back and generated this letter to say that the base flood depth was 9 feet. So once we had that information, Bart and Patty got involved and helped Malcolm and Linda. So I love this next slide because it was a really hot day when Bart came up. And so what he did was he set up his surveying equipment, shoot the nearest water surface elevation of the stream closest to the property, and then added that to the base flood depth to get the base flood elevation generated. Anything you want to add to that, Bart?
No, that's pretty much what happened.
Yeah. So we had a good time. So as you can see, Bart redid the elevation certificate, and if you look at B9, he was able to get a base flood elevation of 773.6. And by doing this little bit of extra work, he was able to click on other and show that it was Corps of Engineers, base flood depth and firm elevations, and had that detailed source of data. So you can see here I kind of started together to show what happens once you get that base flood depth and you have a surveyor that understands what to do with that information. Now, if Bart were to do this elevation certificate and just put that the base flood elevation was 9.0, that is incorrect. So you always want to make sure, keep this presentation handy, that if someone gets the base flood depth, they have to shoot the nearest water surface elevation to determine the base flood elevation of the site. So another resource that came out recently, thanks to Bart for sending this to me, is how to request a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision based upon bill. So I sent this out to you guys probably at the beginning of the year. It's good to back sheet, but it has a beautiful little paragraph next line here that shows what if no base flood elevations have been determined. And so in some instances, when BFPs certain special flood hazard areas have not been determined, FEMA will attempt to calculate the base flood elevation when a LOMA application is submitted for properties of less than 50 lots or 5 acres. So what this means is that you have a zoning property, you go through the Corps, you go ask TVA, neither one of them have any base flood depth information, flood study information. What do I do? There is one last thing that you can try to attempt, and that's to have the surveyor submit on company letterhead that they're requesting a letter of map amendment shown where the property is located or where the structure is going to be. And then they can use that base flood elevation information to complete a finished construction elevation certificate. So they would enter the BFE and B9 and then enter other for B10 and say that FEMA generated the base flood elevation. So one thing that I would stress is that when we send this information to surveyors, when they contact FEMA, they're not saying that they're trying to do a letter of map amendment out as shown. And so FEMA has been reluctant to generate the base flood depth. So you want to make sure that if the surveyor is reaching out to the FEMA mapping information exchange, they have that letter written on letterhead stating that it's going to be a Loma out as shown. So that's an important key to do. And they can do it just for where the structure is going to be located if it doesn't quite meet those metrics. Do you have anything you want to add, Bart?
No.
Okay. All right. So the 265 has some different methodologies when trying to determine the base flood elevation. There are some simplified methods and there are a detailed method. So one thing, if someone is trying to determine the base flood elevation, if you're just doing simplified methods, you can do contour interpolation, and that's based on an overlay of the flood insurance rate map on a topographic work map, and then estimate the water surface elevation at the intersection of the contour, and then just to confirm accuracy if it is acceptable. Sometimes you can do this, like if a development's coming in and before they're able to get a detailed methodology done, you say you need to elevate it so high. And this kind of shows another simplified methodology of doing the data extrapolation method. This is where a surveyor will get the flood insurance study profile and then extend it within 500 feet of the detailed study. But again, you're going to extend the water surface elevation at the same slope, and then you're going to transfer that elevation to map view. But you have to make sure there's no hydraulic structure. So there can't be any bridges or culverts in the detailed study in the site because that affects what the base flood elevation would be. So one thing that there's caution, the FEMA 265 guidebook, simplified methods cannot be used by the community elevation certificate for flood insurance. Communities must use detailed methodologies described within the guidance for completing an elevation certificate. So that's just something for you guys to keep in mind. The other thing that I've seen since I've started this job is sometimes when we're doing community assistance visits, we'll see an elevation certificate where it's a Zone A property, they're building a structure, and the surveyor will say that he or she determined the base flood elevation. You can go out there and use simplified methods for the base flood elevation method, and it should be used for flood insurance rating purposes. So again, can't stress enough. When you're getting elevation certificates, you guys need to be looking at them to make sure that there's accuracy and completeness with that document. If you guys were to come into my office right now, we have 26 communities that have elevation certificate issues. We had one community where it was all elevation certificates for construction projects. So that community is going to be struggling to try to get probably 30 elevation certificates redone. You want to make sure that when you receive those, that you are reviewing them. If you've never reviewed them before and you need help, you can always ask me. You just don't accept it and put it in a file drawer, never just like a day again, because it can, like we were talking about Malcolm and Linda, the community did not review it. They're paying $9,000 for flood insurance for several years when maybe they didn't have to do that. So again, you want to make sure that you look at it. For the detailed method, is having an hydraulic study, looking at the floodplain geometry and the topography, and look at horizontal and vertical coordinates and elevations. The next item that's important for an engineering analysis is a flood discharge or volume, looking at the hydrology. And that would be the feet rate, the stream flow, cubic feet per second, And then flood height, the hydraulics, looking at what the water surface elevation will be or occurs during a flood. For purposes of determining the base flood elevation, that's a 100 year flood or the 1% annual chance of flooding. So there are some instances when there's a large scale development that's occurring in a community. As we talked about through many webinars and trainings, one of the first things you're going to do when you're looking at development is you want to see if there's floodplain within the parcel or site that's going to be developed. So again, going to require that all new subdivision proposals and other proposed development, including proposals for manufactured home parks and subdivisions that are greater than 50 lots or 5 acres, whichever is the lesser, include within such proposals base flood elevation. This is not something that I see a lot when I go about. And so if you are having a large subdivision, it is in a Zone A, before you start issuing permits, you try to have a detailed H&H study done to see if the engineer has calculated the base flood elevation appropriately for the site. Sometimes they can go to Fema, find a HEC-RAS model or a HEC-2 model. Sometimes they have to create the model from scratch, but you want to make sure that that's reviewed before you start development to make sure that the site is reasonably safe from flooding. Excuse me. So this is an example where they're going to have 50 lots or over 5 acres in the Zone A. And so you can see that upper northeast section of the development need to have a base flood elevation determined, detailed methodologies. So again, when you're looking at some of these subdivision examples, you want to see exactly the threshold has to be evaluated to see whether BFE data is required. We did have one development up in Greenville, Tennessee recently that was in a Zone A. So they decided to take all the Zone A floodplain area and put that as open space so that they didn't have to do an engineering analysis. So sometimes you can work with a developer to make sure that the standards are being met or that you have the special flood hazard area as open space in that. So there are some additional considerations into place. So you may not necessarily develop detailed base flood elevation data in large lot subdivisions or single lot subdivisions within the threshold of the NFIP when the actual building sites are clearly outside of Zone A. We talked about many times that whenever someone is giving you a site plan, you want to make sure that they have the national flood hazard layer downloaded on site plan, and then you have the location and dimension where the development is going to be occurring. So that's really important. As you can see here on this site plan, you see the subdivisions kind of in the middle. The Zone A areas are more open space. So again, working with the developer and talking about floodplain management is really important, and having that over-the-counter consultation to make sure that everyone understands what requirements need to be done and how to work within those parameters is really important. And again, there is a flood insurance study profile for developments that exceed the thresholds. BFEs can be obtained from other using detailed methodology in terms of those in the flood insurance study. So when we've been doing engineering reviews, we've had a lot of engineers that create studies that do not reflect and are not identical to what's in the flood study profile. So they have to do multiple profile runs, show where the floodway is going to be delineated. You got to have a 10-year, 50-year, 100, 500-year events within that engineering analysis. So you want to make sure that whenever someone's sending that to you for review, if you send it my way, that they actually have modeling, they actually create a model from scratch. So there are some other threshold requirements. If it falls below the threshold specified in 6.3 BC, no BFE data The community must still apply. The proposed structures and other development within approximate A zones are elevated 3 feet above the highest base grade. So when we're using elevation data, we're going to make sure that once the DFE is established, the development has to fall and comply under C3. So again, if you do have a base flood depth calculated into a base flood elevation for a Zone A property, you're going to elevate that 1 foot above the base flood elevation for residential. If it's non-residential, you can elevate it 1 foot above base flood elevation, or you can dry flood proof it to the base flood elevation. Now, keep in mind, if it is going to be flood proof, there has to be a flood proofing certificate. There has to be a detailed description of what flood resistant materials are being used, how the structure is going to deal with hydrodynamic forces to the building, and what sort of maintenance plan is going to be done for the building. Because you can have a gate or something at the front door or at the back door to try to keep floodwaters out. But if you don't have a maintenance plan and you don't have an exercise every year to make sure you know how to install it, the worst time in the world trying to figure that out is during a flood event, because people are going to be fussing and cussing because they can't get it on there correctly. So again, there's various pieces of the puzzle that have to be done for a flood proofing certificate. Most that I've seen are woefully inadequate. And we were at the Partners in Mitigation, and they said that 80% of flood-proof structures fail. So you do want to pay special attention to that and caution. And if there's for manufactured homes, you do want to elevate them 1 foot above the base flood elevation and have them anchored. And then if there are enclosures below the base flood elevation, you want to make sure that they have adequate flood openings, 1 square inch per 1 square foot, no higher than 1 foot above the ground, either interior or exterior grade. And then it also can be used for parking access. So there are flood insurance. If the structure is being built in Zone A, it has a better exact it will be required to carry flood insurance. So as we talked about many times, if I'm a flood insurance agent and I'm selling flood insurance, I will need a finished construction elevation certificate to create the policy. And then there's other forms that insurance agents deal with, the general property form and the dwelling form based upon what type of structure it is. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is from the city of Erin when there was a gentleman that was building a restaurant called the Flood Zone. He was upset because he had to elevate his parcel 1 foot above the base flood elevation. But after the flood of 2010, he was happy that he elevated his structure. So again, when it's a post firm after communities entered the National Flood Insurance Program and no base flood elevation is provided, the post firm rating considers the elevation of the structure to determine the rates. And so you kind of look at the top of the bottom form minus the highest adjacent grade equals the elevation distance. So that is important, and they do submit it for rates. And as you can see here, when we're looking at base flood elevation, information is available. Again, if you get it from another source, you're going to be looking at the lowest floor minus the base flood elevation equals the elevation difference. The lowest floor elevation is not an entry on the elevation certificate. It's determined by an insurance agent using the information provided on the elevation certificate. So we talked about earlier with Malcolm and Linda Croft, because that information was entered incorrectly, and the insurance agents don't necessarily understand what they're seeing on the forms. It is important to be looking at that to make sure that the information is correct, because we always talk about how folks that want an elevation certificate kind of want 2 out of 3 things. There's fast, cheap, and accurate. Everybody wants it fast. Everybody wants it cheap. And no one really thinks about accuracy. If you have accuracy, it ain't going to be cheap or fast. So I want to make sure that you're reviewing them. If you have questions, again, you can always ask me, or if someone is looking for a surveyor, make sure that you use that certified floodplain surveyor worksheet that has a list of surveyors in your area that are certified. They do have, they do take an exam and they have training on this, so they understand it a little bit more than just opening up the yellow pages or looking online. I sound old when I say yellow pages, right? But when you're looking at it online to try to find a surveyor. So I like this picture because it's in the certified floodplain surveyor class 4 years ago. We were talking about foundation openings when it comes to insurance rates. So I used the example of me and my twin sister. So my house has a crawl space. I have foundation openings, and because I have the correct number of openings, instead of rating it in the footers of my crawl space in 2A, you're actually going to rate my structure based upon the necessary core people B. So it's important to have foundation openings in the structure when there's a crawl space, because you can't get hammered for flood insurance. And as you can see, my sister's house is not happy because she doesn't have any openings in her crawl space. Her insurance rate should be at 2A, which is typically below the base flood elevation. And if you have a structure that's in the zone A, it can also hurt based on the lowest adjacent grade.
I hear you.
So as we talked about with enclosures, these are the standards. Again, you want to make sure that if a structure does have a crawl space, if it's a diagram 7, 8, or 9 on the elevation certificate, based upon the elevation of the footers, if it's below the base flood elevation, you want to make sure that it has foundation openings. And then you want to make sure that there are automatic openings to allow for the water to enter and exit through there and go on its way. So we've already talked about these. I'm not going to necessarily read this again, but just make sure that when someone is having an enclosure, that they do have openings. A window doesn't count, a door doesn't count. Has to be an automatic opening, no human intervention. So elevation certificates, as we've talked about, is an administrative tool to help rate a flood insurance policy. It does record building elevations, and it can, someone who reviews it, demonstrate whether or not it's compliant with the NFIP regulations. As we continue to do community assistance visits, we continue to see compliance issues. So I really implore you guys to review them and make sure that they're complete. You know, it's okay to say Rome wasn't built in a day. I need an extra day or two to review it and have it be reviewed for compliance, because think of it, the person is buying that home and going to be living in that home. If the elevation certificate isn't done correctly, they're going to be paying for it over the life of a loan of 30 years. So you want to make sure that you look at it to make sure that it's complete and compliant. The elevation certificate can support letter of map changes, as we talked about a few months ago, and it can determine proper flood insurance. So as you can see here in the next slide, we talked about different training and handouts that if you have a zone A with no BFE, if you haven't been able to get information from Fema, from TVA, or from the surveyor, is not going to be completing section C. So you complete section A, section B, section D, and then section E, which is on the next form. So again, these are the sections that you want to complete if you don't have a base flood elevation. One thing when we're looking at section E, again, you're going to be looking at, when the surveyor is going to be shooting the elevations, you're going to be looking at it based upon natural grade, and then making sure that if there are flood openings, that E2 is completed. Sometimes this is left blank when there's a crawl space. So you want to make sure that the surveyor has completed these elevations, because it is important for insurance ratings. The next one, I just wanted to show you guys, we were recently doing an audit for the community, and they had one that was in an AO zone, but as you can see, the top of the bottom floor is 4.2 feet below the hay. So that's an issue there. Didn't have some of the stuff done. Again, you don't want to be careless with this because it can hurt a homeowner and it can hurt their bottom line. So the FEMA watershed studies, we've had quite a few watershed studies going on in the state of Tennessee. And a lot of communities have questions as far as when I have a new watershed study, what do I use? Do I use the effective data that I have available? Do I use preliminary? What do I do? So one thing that we've been trying to get the word out is that FEMA has a floodplain management bulletin 1-98 and has information regarding the use of flood insurance study data as available data. So to kind of summarize this, in cases where the base flood elevation increases in the studied area, communities have the responsibility to ensure that new or substantially improved structures are protected. And so FEMA encourages communities to utilize this information in instances where the base flood elevation increase and floodways are revised to ensure that the health, safety, and property of their citizens are protected. So if it is increasing, you should encourage and make it require that they use the new data because the base flood elevation is higher. If you go based upon what's effective right here, right now, once the insurance agent figures out that there's been a new study, that can affect flood insurance rates. So let's do the flip side. So if there's an increase of the base flood elevation, the community should not use this information to regulate floodplain development until a letter of final determination has been issued, or at least until all appeals have been resolved. So again, if it is going to decrease, you might as well use what you have now with your effective flood insurance rate maps to review these elements. We'll make sure that for Zone A floodways, if you have draft or preliminary flood insurance study that has designated floodways or none have previously existed, these communities should use that because that's going to save expense. If I have a Zone A area and then all of a sudden I have preliminary flood insurance rate map and flood insurance study profiles with base elevation information way delineated, that could save an applicant and a lot of time and headache because that data is available and it can save some time and money. So I encourage you, if there's ever a watershed study going on in your community, you can always request that information be sent if someone's doing development within a floodway. So again, when you have Zone A floodways, communities are required that there is an engineering analysis done and that it can have 1 foot increase at any point within the increase. But again, in Zone A floodways, it is difficult to try to get all that information together to create a study. So you can have the engineer check with FEMA, engineering library, or they may have to create a effective model on their own. So as we talked about a moment ago, if there is preliminary data, you can use that. So you always want to make sure that you're looking at the materials whenever we have the county coordination meeting or we have the flood risk review meeting, local community looking at this information to make sure that it's correct. And you know what parcels are being affected, whether the floodplain or floodway is going to expand or contrast. The only mapping meeting that we ever had where it contracted and people were really happy was in Manchester. So, but you do want to make sure that you look at that and where the affected homeowners are at, the word out and do publicity, because it's not FEMA's responsibility or the state's. It is the local community that's going to be living and breathing with this new flood insurance study information and firms. The information. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Bart, and you can talk about letter of map changes in a Zone A.
Yeah, I've had some good luck recently turning in applications for lomas in a zone A, they determine a base flood elevation just 99% of the time they have for me. Now this particular one here, the guy was building a house and he thought he was finished and they wanted final construction elevation certificate, and it didn't comply because he didn't have the vents. He was in a zone A. He didn't have the proper vents, and so the crawl space was the lowest floor. And believe it or not, this guy, well, he put in the proper vents, and about 2 weeks after he did, the water came up and got under the house. And he called me. He said, "I can't have water in the house." I said, "It worked. That's the way it works. You've got vents. Water's going to go through the house. That's what they're designed to do." And believe it or not, he hired a house mover to come up there, and they jacked that house up about 4 or 5 feet above the existing new foundation block walls, filled it up with dirt, built the block walls up another 3 or 4 feet, and then he put in vents. And so he's got his crawl space about 4 foot off the ground. And so what I did when I did the loan application, the MT, it was MT1. He was right next to a side road that had, the creek was behind the house, and there was a crossing, a restriction right there where the creek, unstudied stream, crossed under the road. So we put the house, I think, 4 feet above the top of that bridge, and I sent that information into FEMA. I think we can go to the next slide, Amy. Yeah, this was what this was in my cover letter. MT1 forms, supporting documentation. I give the Skiles Branch unstudied stream. Down toward the bottom, Skiles Branch has never been subject of a detailed flood study. I have attempted to anticipate the materials you'll need to make an evaluation. Okay, next one there. And that's what I turned in, the lowest adjacent grade, 736.3 and 736.4, not available for a BFE source. The next one. I included this in my packet. Now 508, that could be out of shown, except it's built on field. So you can't do an out of shown with an MT1 application. It has to be an MTEZ application. And then 504, of course, is in it slightly. So I included this GIS map with and then I just dashed the houses in there. The next one. Oh, well, that was about the end of, I guess, of that Retro Hughes. That's a crazy name for a road, but Retro Hughes Drive or something. This one, I'm not sure why you included it, Amy, other than this was just a regular letter map amendment removal, and I had an underwriter just for 3 days argue with me that she wanted the true LOMA, that I was sending her just a determination document. And I plead with her. I said, that is the LOMA. It's determined to be removed. And I guess she finally got it in there because I never heard anything more from her. That's about all I have.
Okay. Well, and then we also tried to get some insurance implications as far as post-firm construction rates. Bart and I were talking about trying to have to show that you want to elevate it above the highest adjacent grade, but they actually have to submit it for rate. So this was the only rating table I had that showed without a basement enclosure crawl space or subgrade crawl space. So as you can see, if you go below or no EC, that is, you're going to be charged quite a bit for occupancy. And so this is just a table, but we wanted to do this presentation today just to kind of give you guys some more information. So really appreciate Carrie talking today on behalf of TVA of some of the historic flood studies they have. Want to thank Mark for talking about how base flood depth is determined by the Corps and what submittal requirements you need. And then we always appreciate Bart coming and talking about his adventures with submitting letter of map changes, because if you go on Hamilton County, they probably have the most or the greatest number of letter of map changes in the state. So I know, like, if I ever have questions or something, Bart's been there, done that. So does anybody have any questions? So we'll kind of open up the chat box and see what's going on, what questions you guys have. I'm sorry about the feedback issue. We'll probably have Joseph here next time. He will forcibly mute people. So when you're presenting, it's kind of, you can't do two things at once, unfortunately. Does anybody have any questions?
Amy?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
When you were doing the extrapolation and the interpolation, it says you can't use it for an elevation certificate for insurance purposes, but I believe you can use it for an elevation certificate for floodplain management purposes, just not for insurance.
Right, but that's where people get confused, because they just sometimes we'll use a simplified method and then put it on the elevation certificate. So that's where you got to kind of be careful a little bit what you're using it for, because you know, we've both seen a lot of stuff on the elevation certificates and just trying to make sure. Let's see. Okay, Tom, let's see. All right, so Tom has a question here. Let's see. Estimating elevations close to where A zones meet AE within 500 feet. If it's meeting it within 500 feet, as long as there is not a culvert or something restricting the flow, you can use that within 500 feet. And then sometimes we've had issues where you have that little white line where you have zone AE stops and then it's zone A. And sometimes we've been able to work with AECOM and the mapping contractors to see if they have hydraulic modeling beyond that little white line on the map. So Bart, this is a good question for you. Do you simply interpolate up or down within that 500 feet, or do you merely extend the last known studied BFE to the 500-foot mark linearly into the A zone stretch of the floodplain? Oh, Bart, you're muted.
You can only do it upstream, and if there's no major changes in the grade, and like you said, restrictions, a bridge or culvert, and you just extend the profile line. The 500 feet.
Tommy has a question. If FEMA used flood studies from TVA, why are the flood zones mapped so poorly around TVA lakes? That could be, Tommy. They use different kind of metrics to do detailed studies. And so if it's a rural area, they're probably just going to do approximate A zones. And unfortunately, we had the risk mapping done from 2006 to 2012. And FEMA gives us crumbs as far as funding flood watershed studies and remapping. Every community was supposed to get a new flood insurance rate map every 5 years, and that has not happened. So, sorry. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Okay. If there are certain areas, Tommy, that you want to see restudied, we can always put them on the list. And then sometimes when FEMA has extra money left over, let's say from a coastal study, if there's a smaller riverine study in Tennessee or some of the other states, they will fund smaller scale studies. So let me know what you'd like to see restudied and we can put that on the list. John Maluski, do you have a question? Your hand up. Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? All right, so we'll be having our next presentation September 14th on agricultural structure. So FEMA has come out with some new guidance on that. So we're going to try to get you guys up to speed with that so that you know what to do. All right, hearing or seeing no other questions in the chat box, I just want to thank everybody for their time and participation today. And we'll see you guys hopefully at the conference in October. Thank you.